welcome to Physiology class. In this session, we will be discussing about regulation of respiration. Respiration is a reflex process, but it can be controlled voluntarily also. So normally, quite regular breathing occurs because of two regulatory mechanisms, and they are nervous mechanism and chemical mechanism. And these two regulatory mechanisms are responsible for the maintenance of normal pulmonary ventilation. So let's see each one in detail. At first, we will be discussing about neural regulation of respiration. So the nervous mechanism that regulates respiration includes respiratory centers, afferent nerves, and efferent nerve. Respiratory centers are the centers which are located in the brainstem that controls the rate and rhythm of respiration. Afferent nerves are the sensory neurons that carries information into the brain, and it includes glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. And the efferent nerves are the motor neurons that carries information back from the brainstem, and it includes intercostal nerves and phrenic nerves. I repeat, respiratory centers are the center which are meant for respiration that is located in the brainstem. Afferent nerves includes glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve, and efferent nerve includes intercostal nerves and phrenic nerves. So let's see what is respiratory center. As I've already mentioned, this refers to a group of neurons which controls the rate, rhythm, as well as force of respiration. And they are bilaterally situated in the reticular formation of brainstem. This figure you can see, this is brainstem, which is contributed by midbrain, pons, and medulla. And this respiratory center is located in the reticular formation of brainstem. And depending upon their location, the respiratory centers are located in the pons and medulla, and depending upon their location, the respiratory centers are categorized as medullary centers and pontine centers. The respiratory center located in the medulla is called medullary center, and the one that is located in the pons is called pontine center. Medullary centers include dorsal respiratory group of neuron, or DRG, and ventral respiratory group of neuron, which is otherwise called VRG. And pontine centers include apneustic centers and pneumotaxic centers. So these are the four respiratory centers that are located on our brainstem. So talking about dorsal respiratory group of neuron, they are located in the dorsal aspect of medulla. So talking about its situation, they are located in and around nucleus of tractus solitarius. It primarily contains inspiratory neurons, and therefore they are primarily responsible for inspiration. Since it contains inspiratory neuron, their key function is the maintenance of inspiration or the regulation of inspiration. And it also helps in the integration of sensory information. And since it controls inspiration, they are responsible for the basic rhythm of respiration. So DRG is the most important respiratory center, which is located in and around nucleus of tractus solitarius. It primarily contains inspiratory neurons, and therefore they are responsible for inspiration. And it helps in the maintenance of normal basic rhythm of respiration. Now, the next one is ventral respiratory group of neuron. These are located in and around nucleus ambiguus and nucleus retroambiguus. And it contains both inspiratory as well as expiratory neurons. In DRG, we saw there were only inspiratory neurons. But in the case of VRG, we can notice both inspiratory as well as expiratory neuron. So, since it contains inspiratory and expiratory neurons, they will help in both inspiration as well as expiration, right? But usually what happens is this VRG is inactive during quiet breathing, and it becomes active only during forced breathing. And once forced breathing is stimulated, they control both inspiratory as well as expiratory muscles, since it contains inspiratory and expiratory neurons. I repeat, VRG is located in the ventral aspect of medulla in and around nucleus ambiguous and nucleus retroambiguous. It contains both inspiratory as well as expiratory neurons. Though it contains both inspiratory and expiratory neuron, they becomes active only during forced breathing, and once it becomes activated, it can control both inspiratory as well as expiratory muscles. So they are inactive during quiet breathing. So that is all about the medullary respiratory centers. Now we will discuss about pontine centers, which includes apneustic center and pneumotaxic center. The apneustic center is located in the lower pons. Its function is it increases the depth of inspiration by directly acting on dorsal respiratory group of neuron. As we know, DRG is the one which includes inspiratory neuron and are responsible for the maintenance of normal inspiration, right? So since the apneustic center has got an influence over DRG, it increases the depth of inspiration. Now the next one is pneumotaxic center. It is located in the upper pons. Here you can see this is pneumotaxic center. They are located in the upper portion of pons. Now its function is it acts as a switch between inspiration and expiration. So what it will do is they will inhibit the process of inspiration and it enhances or it begins the process of expiration. So it cuts off inspiration and begins expiration. So how will they perform this? It is by inhibiting apneustic center. So what this pneumotaxic center will do is it will inhibit apneustic center. So once the apneustic center gets inhibited, as we have already mentioned, since it has got an influence over DRG, once the apneustic center gets inhibited, the DRG will automatically get inhibited. So since the DRG is getting inhibited, we know DRG are the new respiratory center which are primarily involved in inspiration. So since this is getting inhibited, the inspiration stops. So once inspiration stops, expiration begins. So this is how the pneumotaxic center influences the switching between inspiration and expiration. So I repeat, pneumotaxic center will inhibit inspiration and it will elicit expiration to begin. And how it will act? By inhibiting apneustic center. Once apneustic center gets inhibited, DRG gets inhibited, and once DRG is getting inhibited, the inspiratory neurons are getting inhibited, and therefore inspiration ends or inspiration stops, and then expiration begins. Now, let's see what are the factors affecting respiratory centers. The first one is impulses from higher center. The impulses from higher center can either stimulate or inhibit the respiratory centers directly. So, the higher centers alter the respiration by sending impulses directly to the dorsal respiratory group of neuron. That is how they will either stimulate or inhibit respiratory centers. Now, the second factor affecting is impulses from stretch receptors of lung. This is attained with the help of a reflex called Herring-Broer reflex. So this Herring-Broer reflex is a protective reflex that restricts inspiration and prevents overstretching of lung tissues. So here what happens is, the stretch receptors, as you all know, it gives response to stretch of the tissues. So during inspiration, there is stretching of lungs due to entrance of air, resulting in stimulation of stretch receptors, which are present in the alveoli of lungs. So once this stretching occurs, the stretch receptors get stimulated. It in turn sends signals, and what happens is the response will be to inhibit or to restrict inspiration, so that overstretching of the lungs can be prevented. So this is called Herring-Broer reflex. Now the third factor affecting is impulses from irritant receptors of lungs. This irritant receptors are present in the bronchi and bronchioles, and they are stimulated by irritant chemical agents like ammonia and sulfur dioxide. So whenever the irritant receptor gets stimulated, there will be hyperventilation. Stimulation of irritant receptors produce reflex hyperventilation along with bronchospasm. So why this is happening? It is because the hyperventilation along with bronchospasm will prevent the further entry of harmful agents into alveoli. And this is how the irritant receptors are functioning. Now, the next factor affecting is impulses from thermoreceptors. As you all know, thermoreceptors are the cutaneous receptor which give response to change in the environmental temperature. And there are two types of thermoreceptors, and they are cold and warm receptors. So when the body is exposed to cold, or when cold water is applied over the body, the cold receptors are stimulated, and it in turn sends signals to cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex stimulates the respiratory center and causes hyperventilation. And this, the resultant is stimulation of cold receptor results in hyperventilation. Now, the next factor affecting is impulses from proprioceptors. Proprioceptors are the receptors which give response to change in the position of the body. So the proprioceptors are usually stimulated during muscular exercises. So what happens? There will be, we know that during muscular exercises, we will be in high demand, we will be in need of oxygen, or there will be a higher demand of oxygen. So in order to compensate that, there will be hyperventilation. So stimulation of proprioceptors also results in hyperventilation. Now the next factor affecting the respiratory center is impulses from pain receptors. The pain receptors are otherwise called nociceptors. The pain receptors also causes hyperventilation. So this is all about the factors affecting respiratory center, and that is all about neural control or nervous control of respiration. Now let's see the chemical regulation of respiration. The chemical mechanism of regulation of respiration is operated through the chemoreceptors, which give response to changes in blood such as hypoxia, hypercapnia, and acidosis. That is, whenever the PO2 is decreased, PCO2 is increased and pH is also increased. What these chemoreceptors will do? They will detect these changes and correspondingly give information. So this is what is a function of chemoreceptor. So these are the sensory nerve endings which are highly sensitive to changes in PCO2, PO2, and pH of blood. And the chemoreceptors are of two types, and they are peripheral chemoreceptor and central chemoreceptors. Peripheral chemoreceptors are of two types, and they are carotid body and aortic body. The carotid body is located in the either side of bifurcation of common carotid artery. Here you can see one of the peripheral chemoreceptors called carotid body is located on either side near the bifurcation of common carotid artery. And the aortic body is located in the arch of aorta. So what causes what is the stimulus, or what causes the stimulation of peripheral chemoreceptor is hypoxia, hypercapnia, and acidosis. And what will be the response? The afferent impulse from the chemoreceptor stimulates DRG neuron. And as we know, once the DRG neurons get stimulated, I neurons or inspiratory neurons are getting stimulated, which in turn results in hyperventilation. So this is how the peripheral chemoreceptors work. The second one is central chemoreceptor. Central chemoreceptor, as the word itself denotes central, which means it will be in the CNS, right? So the central chemoreceptors are located in the medulla oblongata. It is located in the brainstem, and that too in the medulla oblongata. The stimulus is they get stimulated by H+ concentration of CSF and interstitial fluid of brain. So the central chemoreceptors will be continuously monitoring the hydrogen ion concentration in the CSF as well as interstitial fluid, whether there is any acidosis state or not. So the function is they regulate the respiration from minute to minute, and their stimulation also results in rate and depth, increase in rate and depth of respiration. That is, hyperventilation will be result. So in a nutshell, both the chemoreceptors, whether it may be central or peripheral, the stimulation of both these chemoreceptors will result in hyperventilation. So here in this flowchart, you can see hypoxia, hypercapnia, and acidosis, that are the key stimulus for peripheral, central and peripheral chemoreceptors, right? So once the hypoxia or acidosis occur, what happens? The peripheral chemoreceptor gets stimulated. And when hypercapnia is developed, there will be increased carbon dioxide concentration in the interstitial fluid. As a result, there will be elevation in the hydrogen ion concentration. So once the hydrogen ion concentration in the CSF or interstitial fluid gets elevated, it will be monitored by the central chemoreceptor. As a result, both peripheral as well as central chemoreceptors are getting stimulated, and they in turn stimulate the medullary respiratory center, especially dorsal respiratory group of neuron, resulting in hyperventilation. So this is how the chemical regulatory mechanism works. Okay, so the normal pulmonary ventilation is maintained by both nervous as well as chemical regulation. The nervous mechanism includes respiratory centers, which are located in medulla and pons, and the chemical regulation includes chemoreceptors, that are peripheral and chemoreceptors. And this is how normally pulmonary ventilation is maintained in a normal physiological state. So that is all about this session. I hope the concept is clear. Thank you.